Well, welcome. Welcome. How are you doing? You made it. You figured a way through. Yeah, we didn't realize how many soccer games were going to happen right away. But other than that, thank you for making it out here. I'm going to do my rock star thing. I should get some scarves here. But how's it all going? Are you all ready for some history? Yeah. Then you're in the right place. Excellent. Thanks. Hi, I'm Jim Newland, past president of the Mesa History Center and a professional historian and SDSU alum. We got our public history undergrad and grad student course folks here. Ways. Get used to your indentured lives as grad students and undergrads. This is what's coming. All right, fantastic. Thanks all. And all of you who've come once again to hear a little bit about our next 17th annual home tour here from the Mesa History Center. It's become a great tradition, and we really, of course, need to thank everybody, especially all of our platinum sponsors, and you'll see a little bit about that here. So let me prompt that right here. This is what we're talking about today. So I'm really going to focus today's talk on talking about these neighborhoods that we're focused on. So some of you know over the last few years we've really had a great opportunity to delve into the stuff that, of course, some of us don't think is that old, like the mid-century, but is starting to gain some interest in preservation in those 50s or 60s. And even last year we had a 1970s house on our tour. Well, this year we're going back. Our newest house on this year's tour is 1938. And we're going to feature our oldest house ever on the tour, which is the second oldest house in La Mesa, built in 1893. So get ready for going back to the past, not to the future this time. All right, so make sure, hopefully you get your tickets. I know some of you are here to learn a little bit more. Some of you are going to help us out. And of course, as well as our sponsors, we need to thank our good friends here at Principal Babbitt here at La Mesa Dale School for honoring us. This is one of those, I think there's a 12 or 13 Sam Hamill designed elementary schools for La Mesa Spring Valley, and you can still see some of them try to sneak a little modernism. He was trying to sneak in here in an elementary school back in 1949. So next year, this school will be having its 75th anniversary. So pretty exciting stuff going on around town here. So thanks our folks here at the school district. And then also, of course, thanks to all our volunteers, and especially, as you're going to hear, our true preservation heroes. That's our theme this year, since we just happen to have to move the date a week that we happen to be on Veterans Day. So you'll hear about some of that in some of the homes that we have. We have some veterans who lived at these homes, and I'll talk a little about their history as well. So we're really going to get into this today, talking about the fact that we have, like I said, our oldest home that we've ever had on the tour, 1893. I think it's our first 19th century property. There's not that many in La Mesa, so that's part of it. And obviously our homeowners are our preservation heroes this year, as they are every year. And we know we have some home tour alums out there, wave all you home tour alums who braved having your house on our tour to benefit us. This is our largest fundraiser of the year. It helps us cover all our costs so that we can help people research their houses, come and gather things for the archives, get things digitized, and make them more accessible. So we appreciate all that, as well as all the fun events. And for the first time this year, we will be open Halloween night. Ooh. So we're part of the downtown event, and we will have a little bit of Halloween-y stuff, including perhaps, I don't know, maybe a hearse and a few other things at the site. So don't miss it, and candy and all that other good stuff as well. So bring your folks by, or just bring by yourself. All right, so based on all that, are we ready to get into it? All right, let's get to it. So we're going to focus on these three sort of early neighborhoods around downtown La Mesa, that today is downtown La Mesa, and that's going to be Porter Hill, Boulder Heights, and Lookout Park, which is part of Mount Nebo, or where Mount Nebo is located for use, and we'll get into that a little bit. So this is really the focus of the downtown for us, right? So I give you it on a modern map, you get a little more understanding. And Mount Nebo technically is the lower peak around Prospect Park. And for a while there, the Windsor Hills folks, and I'll talk about that in the 20s, tried to announce the higher peak, which is around where Summit Drive goes, as Point Airy. It didn't stick, as you could guess. It didn't stick, that name. But we're going to get into that a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit about how those things happen and how we got there. Obviously, culturally, this area goes back thousands of years. The Kumeyaay people have been here. Now, some of our archaeological records goes back, at least 15,000 years before present, that we had folks here taking care of the land and living culturally. Obviously, that was changed significantly with the arrival of the Spanish colonial missionaries and soldiers in around 1769. The creation of the mission eventually moved downriver, and these areas were all part of what eventually would become a private rancho grant, the ex-mission grant, and we'll talk about that in a second, but we have sort of that. And these areas were all sort of known, and the boundaries are sort of mushy back then, but basically we were within what would eventually become the ex-mission grant. That was deeded to, in the Mexican period, to Don Santiago Arguello, who at one time was the Comandante of the Presidio of San Diego and was a very important individual. As with most rancho owners after the American occupation and takeover, there were long land cases, and eventually his family sold off most of that property over time to different people before they actually settled the land case, which wasn't actually settled until 1884. So it took almost 25 years to get that land case settled. And two of the larger property owners that purchased chunks of that were one Robert Allison and another one a gentleman by the name of John Harbison. Most of that property is what makes up today's city of La Mesa, those two 4,000-acre grants that they got, Allison in about 1869 and Harbison in about 1874. So if you were looking at sort of this area of the Mesa, and the name the Mesa comes basically from those back in the Spanish colonial Mexico period of looking up from Mission Valley to the tablelands to the south. And so in general, to those folks, they would have thought the Mesa is pretty much anything from about, Mission Hills today all the way up to Mount Helix, right? That was the Mesa, the tabletop lands on this bluff above Mission Valley, roughly. And so, things that were going on. So you had Allison's property, which sort of sticks up to about today's University Avenue, swung all the way down into what's Lemon Grove, and then Harbison's, which pretty much takes up what's now North La Mesa down into the college neighborhoods of San Diego. And so there were two main roads through this area at that time, with the Choyas Road, which is now roughly the University Avenue route, right here near us here, that was officially identified as a county road in 1872, and the Cajon Road via the Mesa, or the Cajon Road, and then later El Cajon Avenue and Boulevard. And those were the two sort of main routes to get out, and they've been around. That was surveyed in the early 1880s and platted out. Because of all the land cases, the area in Spring Valley was the first to sort of settle because it was not within any rancho boundaries, so it was able to be claimed earlier. But there really wasn't much going on in either of these properties. Harbison was known because he was a beekeeper. He actually invented patented apiary to raise bees, and that was a really good thing out here because we don't have a lot of water, as you might guess. And so a lot of agricultural dreams that people had of developing this area as an agricultural area were challenged by the fact that we don't get a whole lot of rain here, right? And so and Allison actually he was a stockman, and he owned butcher stores and downtown. He owned parts of Rancho Cuyamaca, he owned some large land out near Campo, and this 4,000 acres where he would either run, we think mostly sheep he ran here. And the key and why it was nicknamed Allison Springs, because the northernmost springs in Spring Valley bubble up at a place today we call Collier Park, right? The Allison Springs. And that's sort of why that area got that name. There was also a couple of halfway houses or little places you might stop to get your horses watered or get something, and that was at Jepson's, which is basically where University meets Massachusetts today, right in there. And then there was one, Dan Manning, which we're pretty sure was probably about where the interchange of the 8 and the 125. It was right in that area, long since disturbed, of course. But so not a whole lot of folks living out here, probably just a few families at the point of the 1880s. Now that all changes in the mid-1880s when the railroads get here, both to LA and to into San Diego, and the great real estate boom hits. You see a lot of speculation and a lot of hope in development. This is when the city of San Diego is going to go from 5,000 population to reportedly 40,000 in about 3 years. I'm not sure that's 100% accurate, but it went up a lot. And this is where you start to get streetcars and sewers and water systems and all that kind of stuff going in, growing. And out here, the company called the San Diego Flume Company decided, well, we can make some money. We got to get the water from the mountains where it rains more down here to the Mesa and into the city. And they bought up Harbison's land, and well as built the flume system, which starts at Cuyamaca Dam up near Cuyamaca Rancho State Park. And if you don't know, I work for state parks, so I'll throw as many state park references as I can into this when I can do that. And so through a system of flumes and tunnels and bridges, we're able to bring it all the way down across around the El Cajon Valley, over what was known as the Alta Pass, which we know as Grossmont, and ending it at a reservoir, which we now call Briarcrest Park. It was originally the Eucalyptus Reservoir. And from there, a ditch went up into where they were going to build a new reservoir called La Mesa Reservoir, which is now Lake Murray, and another pipe system that took it down to Lemon Grove to feed those lands down there, Spring Valley and Lemon Grove. So with the guys, they're going to take all that water from the mountains where it rains, twice as much and bring it down here. And it all sounded good, and you can see pictures. They did an amazing job. It took them about 4 years to complete it and finished it, opened up in February of 1889, which was just in time for Governor Waterman's San Diego, Cuyamaca, and Eastern Railway to make it through out east. There was always a push to get another direct east route railroad out of San Diego. Because right now we were at the end of a spur line from Los Angeles, and contingent on what was going on up there with Southern Pacific and Santa Fe, who ran their line down to us along the coast to National City, where it ended. So Waterman, who had made his money in mining and had been he was lieutenant governor. When the governor for him passes away unexpectedly, he becomes governor. He owns the mines up at Cuyamaca Rancho area, the Stonewall Mine, and thought, hey, if I could just get a railroad to go up east out here. And he got it as far as Foster's, which is right across the river from Lakeside. And they completed that in 1889 as well and opened it up. And that's the route today that you mostly see, the San Diego trolley. They bought the right-of-way about 40 years ago, and then that's where the trolley line is now. Basically follows that route, except it only goes to Santee right now. But anyway, it gives you that. So now you have connections, right? But the situation about this that was unique is the Flume Company had come up with this plan of subdividing those 4,000 acres of Harbisons, right? And they thought, well, we'll put the town site directly south of our reservoir, centered today on what would be 70th and El Cajon Boulevard. And if you look at that map, you can see the La Mesa town site, where the La Mesa School is going to be built, and the La Mesa Church, right? And over here, where the railroad ended up going through Lemon Grove up through Allison Springs, and then off, wasn't there. Sort of like having the freeway bypass your town, right? So this wasn't good for La Mesa, even though they had started out to develop it. And the lots you can see here are mostly outside of that little town site. They're mostly 5 and 10 acre lots, because the idea was they're going to sell these to prospective citrus ranchers. The great citrus boom had already hit Los Angeles, Riverside, San Bernardino, Orange counties, and was making lots of money with the ability to take an orange grown out here year-round, right, because of our sun and weather, and putting it on this newfangled thing called a refrigerated boxcar and selling it to somebody in New York in January. That was a big deal. That was really Southern California's first serious economic entity. I mean, we're going to get entertainment and aerospace, but that's sort of the first piece. And if you want to learn more about it, you can go to California Citrus State Historic Park in Riverside and learn all about that. So I'll throw them in when I can. But here in La Mesa, this was really key. So now you have the folks trying to come in. The Flume Company says, hey, buy one of our lots and we'll be able to get you the water, because we've got this great system to bring the water down here to arid southern San Diego area. And so that's the La Mesa colony. So this begins sort of the split identity of La Mesa, the town site and Allison Springs. So the town site, as goes. There's a school built in 1891, La Mesa School, as well as you begin to see here and there little notes about folks living, growing their citrus, building up their citrus ranches, building houses, et cetera, including Dr. Wilson's infamous guavas. Guava, oh yeah, there we go, right? So all those kinds of things that are sort of sneaking around to go back to this date, this period. DeWitt Williams Ranch up there, if you go up to DeWitt Street and Williams north of El Cajon. We also had Hervey Park, who was the heir to the Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company, buying up the land around this little natural spring that he created a pond in. You can see that pond when you're sitting at Anthony's today. And that's over there near where our tour was last year, right? Or the James Schuyler, who was actually the engineer who designed the Sweetwater Dam, which was another water system that was going to bring water, of course, to National City and Chula Vista. That one, he designed that dam, well-known, and then bought 60 acres right next to Allison's property, put that house and laid it out in citrus, and then sold it to another developer by the name of Andrew Crowder a couple years later. And that was known as the Lookout Ranch, which is where the original name of the street that we name our newsletter after today is all about. So you were seeing these kind of sort of citrus operations happening in the 1890s around here. And then at that point, Allison's son, James, partnered up with Mr. Crowder and put a little subdivision around the railroad depot that was called, and they decided not to name it either Crowderville, good move, or Allison Springs anymore because they thought it was confusing. They decided to call it La Mesa Springs. And one of the reasons was the post office decided to put the post office at Allison Springs for the La Mesa area because it was on the railroad. First little benefit, right? So instead of calling it Alice Springs, they thought, well, since the post office is called La Mesa, we might as well make it La Mesa Springs. And so they decided to change that. And that sort of changes Allison Springs. By 1895, everybody's starting to call it La Mesa Springs. So you had La Mesa, which was the town site, and then you had La Mesa Springs by 1895. And there's the old store, which is still half underneath the building there at the corner where the dog washing businesses, right? They got expanded. And then a little down the street was where they had their packing house, of which had a lovely large second floor where it was known to have dances and events and stuff up. And the Mesa Springs Hall, as you can see, that's on the sign there. So the 1890s, this was sort of the core commercial area for all those folks trying to make it in citrus farming in the 1890s. So if we look at this shot sort of looking east, you can see the Lemon Company stuff. You can see Lookout Ranch location just off the edge of Allison's property. And a new property we're going to talk about, the Roach Ranch, here in a moment. So if we look back then to the east, 2 years later, you begin to see that the development around La Mesa Springs begins to fill out. Now, interesting enough, when the school there was established in 1895, they still call it the Allison School. And so up until they merged them in the 19-teens, you had the La Mesa School and the Allison School. But the community's growing enough that they have, baseball teams, and they begin to bring a church over here in the La Mesa Springs. And you can see it's just slowly growing, but you can see even off to the left here, still orchards, and most of the areas around what we would now see as suburban housing. All right, so now let's get to our first property we want to talk about. And a Civil War veteran, an English immigrant by the name of Henry Roach, who had come to Michigan with his family in the 1840s, and ended up in 1862 at age 17 enlisting in the Union Army. He served for 3 years honorably, and upon his discharge decided that the Army life must have been for him, because he re-enlists and he's sent to Texas, where he serves in the cavalry for a few years. Once his time is up there, he then begins to go into business in Texas. He begins to build stores and ranches, and begins to move into the cattle business. It was a good time, growing time to be there in the 1870s, and ends up becoming quite the successful cattleman. Begins to invest in other businesses, properties, banks, and in other investments. He marries the post's daughter, the commander's daughter, Sarah. And once the boom hits in the 1880s, he's already well known as this sort of wealthy guy, and he starts coming in the summers to San Diego, because now for the railroad, it's a little easier to get out here. You don't have to take wagons across, you can hop on the railroad, even go up to LA, and then get down here, not too bad, a few days to get from Texas to San Diego. And he starts to realize that the summer weather here is a whole lot better than Central Texas, right? And so he starts coming, and he starts investing, getting himself involved in the community. He's actually, I find information, he was involved in the first Cabrillo celebration, one of the first big historical pageants here in 1892. He's working with a lot of the veteran organizations. He's investing in banks and businesses, and he starts buying up property throughout Southern California, but mostly in San Diego. And basically, in January of 1892, he ends up purchasing a couple of those La Mesa Colony lots right across from Crowder's Lookout Ranch property along the main road, the Cajon Road, right there. And he spent a whopping $1,300, which is that's a lot of money in 1892. And we don't have a whole lot of information on it, because it doesn't appear that he spent a whole lot of time here. But we do have one reference of him that he's starting to build out and plant his ranch in citrus is by early as May of 92. And that point there. From there, there's not a whole lot of business other than when you see him and his wife doing sort of social things or business things in downtown. But it appears that sometime around 1893, he has one of the noted, and there weren't too many architects in San Diego at the time, a noted architect, John Stannard, appears to have built this for him, because there's references in the paper to Stannard building another home for Roach back home in Brackettsville, Texas. And so the assumption is he probably hired him. That's what the folks who did the nomination for this property figured out. And I think it makes some sense, though it's not 100%. But either way, what's interesting about it is that it is very much a kind of house you would see in Texas or Louisiana. It's very typical of the wraparound porch, the sort of not heavy Victorian, it's very folk Victorian, but the details that sort of have a French colonial sort of element to them, which was a very typical, if you think about Louisiana, Texas, there's that influence there, and you will see houses like that. It's also built up off the ground, because you need cold storage underneath your house, something we don't think about out here too often, but in a place like Texas or back east, you often want that lower level. And that was all. So it's very typical. It's a stone-based foundation, raised up about 5.5 feet off the ground, so there's plenty of clear storage, and used to get under there and use that space, and very much that style. So that house we know is here pretty much by 1893 based on that and some tax records. So if we look at a few years later, the look of this, Lookout Ranch is there on the baseline. You can see the Cone crossing, and a couple elements of the old La Mesa Colony is still there. What was originally called out in La Mesa Colony, Mandan Drive and Chippewa Drive, those routes still pretty much are followed by a couple of roads we have today, Randlet and Tio Diego, partially cover those same areas. But you can see the house there, surrounded mostly by citrus, right? Other than Crowder, who's planted some eucalyptus along the road here. And that whole area north of the road is pretty much what Roach's property was. Here's another shot. And just to the east, a couple years later, a friend of his from the Army named Colonel Randlet, James Randlet, ends up buying the lot next to him and building another house, which will be later known, and I'll talk about that for the next owners of these properties. But so you're seeing that sort of semi-retirement. I'm going to buy some property, I'm going to invest a little bit in it, and build these sort of what we often call in California sort of architectural, social history, how the gentleman's ranch. Not a place necessarily to live full time, but a place to have an operation, invest in some property, make a little money growing citrus, and so you're not paying for everything, right? Now, something changes in 1895. We find some records that Sarah Roach, the wife, purchases the property from Henry. And purchases this in quotations because we pretty much are sure it's part of the divorce settlement. So we know that she sort of on and off stays there for a couple years. There's a couple references in the papers. She shows up in one of the director years. But she's still pretty much traveling back to Texas where her kids all live, around San Antonio, Brackettville area over there, Del Rio. In that area, they owned a lot of property in there. And so we see that sort of, and it makes sense. And it made sense a little more the next year when there are a couple of newspaper references that Henry has remarried. Here in San Diego, someone he met here in San Diego. And I'm sure, there was nothing to the fact that he was 51 and she was 29. But, these things, like you think this never happened in the past. Come on. Anyway, so just so you know that interesting sort of thing where we think this is one of the reasons the property didn't get full use. We know that they were hiring caretakers to take care of the ranches and probably had someone living at the ranch house, as part of that to make sure the place was being kept up. So there's a sort of change in ownership this period. And this isn't often brought up. This is some stuff that I just was digging into a little deeper. This sort of makes sense as you look a little bit later, right? Now remember, we're talking about our veterans, right? It's preservation heroes. When the Spanish-American War breaks out in 1898, Roach sends a letter to the governor of Michigan offering his services to re-enlist. He is given a commission as a captain and is sent off, and he ends up going to Cuba with the regiment from Michigan, where he serves admirably, seeing action, also was involved in overseeing a prisoner of war camp, and then eventually he's doing so well that he gets named as chief of staff to the commanding general in Cuba after the war, General Lawton. But like most of the folks who had challenges on the Spanish-American War, this is similar to the Mexican war with Mexico, the number one casualty causer in both of those conflicts was disease. And late in early in 1899, it appears that he gets malaria. And he gets so sick that they discharge him and send him back home. And this is going to sort of haunt him, of course, to that. But this sort of changed it. But in the meantime, he was actually breveted up to major, and that's why in the records we'll occasionally see Major Roach and Colonel Randlet, and we kept saying, wait a minute, he looks like he's enlisted in the Civil War. What happened? It was this service in the Spanish-American War that got him an officer commission. So he will come back and forth, and he ends up coming out to San Diego in early 1902, with the hope of getting better, but it doesn't work out. And in July of 1902, he passes away here in San Diego. He had a nice home in what now we would call Bankers Hill. He passes away, which then triggers a 2-year fight on probate and will between the previous Mrs. Roach, the current Mrs. Roach, and the daughter. Takes him 2 years to sort of work it all out. Everybody gets their piece of his extremely large, at that time it was somewhere around $80,000 estate. That's a lot of money in 1902. And so it eventually gets worked out. So in the meantime, this is one of the reasons why the branch just sort of sits. In the meantime, Sarah Roach had moved to Chicago for a couple years and then apparently moves back to Texas and forgets that she had taken out a mortgage on the ranch in 1899. Of course, the mortgage holder doesn't forget. And in 1904, he files a suit to get his money back. The court basically makes a settlement that gives him half ownership in the property. Just about this time, it works out for Mrs. Roach and Mr. Chambers is that Another family has come to San Diego or are looking for a place to settle, Dr. Henry Porter. And he wants to bring his family here to sort of semi-retire as well. And in September of 1905, after about having lived in the property for about a year, with all the title cleared, Roach and Chambers sell the property to Dr. Porter. Now this is going to start one of those fascinating stories of, talk about a long-standing family. The Porters are going to buy this property in 1905. They sell it last year, right? 117 years of family ownership of this property. Porter is a fascinating individual. Born in Wisconsin, he graduated first from Boulder Heights College, then the Andover Seminary, and then from Northwestern Medical School. In 1872, he decides his calling is as a missionary. He goes to China. He ends up in a village about 250 miles south of Peking, which is now Beijing, and where he starts a school and a hospital and a church, trying to bring some civilization, quote, bring some modern stuff to this area, right, including Christianity. He actually goes back a few years later, marries a wife in Wisconsin, comes back, and all three of their sons are born in China, actually. And that's Lucius, Chapel, and James Tank, which you'll hear about more. Now, if anything know about the history of China, in about 1900, the Boxer Rebellion hits. And basically, this is very much an anti-foreigner movement in China, that all these colonizing groups coming in needed to be moved out. Fearing for that and beginning to have some health issues, they decide they need to get out of there. And they leave China and then begin to look for a place so that they can retire. They happen to hit the coast here. They end up somehow down in San Diego, go to La Mesa, rent the Roach Ranch, and then buy it, right? That's going to start, like I said, 117-year ownership for this family. In the meantime, the siblings, his brother Edwards and sister Mary, are going to eventually, a couple years later, buy Randlett's Ranch, giving them both those ranches I was talking about, and changing the name of that area to Porter Hill. Right? So that's where that all comes from. They decide to name their home. This is sort of a tradition in a lot of houses. You'll see that in a couple of these. The Hill of Peace, Ping Shan, which means the Hill of Peace in Chinese. He and his wife continue to be leaders. They get very involved in the Congregational Church, which was one of the first couple churches here in La Mesa Springs, and begin to get involved in other civic activities and all. He will eventually die in 1916, and his wife Elizabeth then holding the property for. The family will become involved in many things over the years. Edwards will actually become the de facto mayor, the president of the board from 1920 to 24. They will donate the land and build the building, which becomes the first library building, which is now known as Porter Hall. You see it in its original site there. Will eventually be moved across the road in 1964 when they build the adult center on that site. And the family also then deeded all the property that's now MacArthur Park to the city as well. So very much civic-minded group and very involved in the community in a lot of ways. And probably no more such than the youngest son, James Tank Porter. James had gone to Beloit College, but interesting enough, he had an injury playing football, which required the amputation of his foot. Football was a tough game. They almost outlawed it in 1905 and 1909, just so you know if you're wondering about that. And so he came back. He ended up recuperating here at the La Mesa house. After about 3 or 4 years, he was in good enough shape to go to Pomona College, where he began to study art. He also was involved in inventing. He invented interestingly later, some sprinkler heads and all kinds of interesting things. He was very, very creative. And while there, he then got an opportunity to go to Columbia University, where he went to the Beaux Arts School and learned how to sculpt and became well known. And by the time of World War I, he was already well known on the East Coast as a sculptor and had several exhibitions there. After World War I, he returns to California, marries another artist by the name of Lenore Branham, and they move in with his widowed mother here at the house in La Mesa. What's fascinating is that he will become a very big leader in the San Diego arts movement. And if you mention, I see on the slide, I said, all these houses have some kind of connection to art that I'm going to get to you about. It's fascinating how they all sort of have this connection. And James Tank Porter is a pretty significant guy. Helped form the Contemporary Artists of San Diego organization, was president of the Arts Guild for many years, helped form the Foothills Art Association here in La Mesa. He also helped create the Planning Commission here in 1927. Very forward-thinking guy. If you caught some of my lectures before, he's the guy during World War II who said, let's hire this young hot architect, Lloyd Rocco, to do a new plan for the city and see what you all think about it. And of course, it was a little too far out there for La Mesa at the time, but moved that the art, the modernist architects and artists of the area, which we'll connect in a little bit later, was all part. So he's very much a leader, as well as his wife, Lenore. And that photo there is some of the top artists in San Diego, and I'll talk about a few of them here more as we get into this story. And there's Lenore standing there with guys like Charles Fries and Alfred Mitchell and other key artists of San Diego, well-renowned locally and nationally artists from San Diego. So they were very much involved in all those kinds of things. Of course, over the years, the family continued to hold the house. Lenore and James' daughter, Ann Porter, married Mr. Hall. They lived there up until a few years ago, and then, like I said, just last year, the family ended up selling the house, and luckily a local in the neighborhood person got it, who recognized what they got. We weren't quite ready to buy, so we didn't put an offer in, but we thought about it. And purchased it, and it's now there. And we're just so excited because for many years, we'd always ask, hey, you think you might be on the home tour? And our new owners said, you bet, you bet. So this is one of our amazing homes that you're going to get a chance to see, as well as, the fact that not only is this house an amazing piece of architectural and historical significance for La Mesa as the second oldest standing house in the community, but it also has James' art studio. And it's, as I like to say, preserved in time. There's still work of both James and Lenore in this building you'll get to see if you come on the tour. And it's just amazing thing to think that this is a spot where, some amazing artwork done. He also actually opened a foundry that was in La Mesa, not here, but for a while, and did sculpting, bronze sculpting, all these casting and all those kind of things. And in fact, I found him, here's another reference, right? I found his picture at the El Presidio State Historic Park in Santa Barbara, because part of that park includes the 1920s Santa Barbara School of Art, where he learned how to cast. And there's a photo of him both teaching and taking courses when he was there in the mid-20s for about a year. So really renowned and interesting both family as well as art and architectural history of the area. So what's going on by the time this house is going and Roach sells it to the Porters? You're beginning to see that community around La Mesa Springs beginning to grow, and beginning about 1906 or 7 to start to suburbanize, getting away from the citrus ranches, which really never took off here. The challenge we had here in San Diego County is we just don't have as much water. You think, Los Angeles Riverside are pretty arid too, but they have a lot more water source than we do down here. And we never really got the citrus industry going, especially because there was a pretty prolonged drought from about 1897 to 1904, which will include sort of converting our agricultural interests to what was on in this area, like La Mesa Dale and the acres, which were poultry farms. And that really starts kicking in during the teens and 20s. But in the meantime, the schools are expanding. We're having more fun playing baseball. There's the Women's Club, which is our oldest existing service club, which goes back to 1902. You're beginning to see it look a little more like a suburban community. Thus, by February 1912, the city of a little over 700 is going to incorporate. And by this time, this shot coming from Mount Nebo, sort of linking back down, you can sort of see where the McKinney House Museum is now. The Opera House is where Por Favor restaurant's on that site, different building, but that site. The Bank of La Mesa Park and Grable real estate office, which was at Spring and La Mesa Boulevard, which was then called Lookout. You also begin to see sort of our suburban housing. You begin to see now single-family homes on little lots that were suburban-sized lots, and you begin to see that, and the places marketed as San Diego's Pasadena, which was considered one of the premier bungalow kind of suburban communities of Los Angeles, and that name stuck in a lot of places. There's that Irving Gill designed bank building and real estate office that used to be on that corner. It was torn down in 1921, unfortunately. The only other Irving Gill that we had in La Mesa was out at La Mesa Heights School, which was torn down in 1932, but we did have two for a little while. But you're beginning to see, and the Park Grable Company is the main developer of La Mesa Springs and all the subdivisions around downtown. And if you look at this map, you can see how many, those are all subdivisions that were Park Grable subdivisions, right? And so you began to see this whole change up and the push for them to suburbanize and build housing lots. Now, one of the guys who comes out here in that period is a guy named Benjamin Lister. He's from Canada, and he brings not only his wife Flossie and his young family, but his retired father, Philip. He joins in on the Park Grable Company, but also on his own begins to buy a lot of lots and develop some properties for himself, including one on the little hill just to the east of downtown that was going to get named Boulder Heights. And the reason it's going to be called Boulder Heights is because there was a little bit of granite quarrying on its south end and on its north end near the Lookout Ranch side. And so it's just sort of a name that ended up sticking there, right? And so he buys a bunch of, including this one really nice view lot on top of Boulder Heights in 1908. And how we know when this, and this is one of the fun of doing some of these house histories, is my friends who own this house now, they weren't sure what day, they could not find a hard date because they thought it could have been anywhere built from 1908 to 1914 based on the county tax record. And we were able to, through photographs, to sort of pin this down. So sometimes you can't find building permits, you can't find tax record. What do you got to do? So we have two equal shots, one from July 4th of 10, which we look over the top of the hardware store, and there's no buildings on top of that hill. And my 1911, guess what's up there? July 4th. We know the date of that photograph 100%. We know when that photograph, and with those two photographs, right? And based on some other photographs that I'll show you here, we're pretty sure it was probably built in late 10, and that's the date you'll see in the guide on it, because we think we finally got it pinned down. So all the fun of trying to do this house research, right? Now, as we begin to see, and we have some shots then that we can pretty much confirm that are early 11, and the house is pretty much there, looks complete, because there's another house that's going to be right next to it that was built by Benjamin for his family, just maybe 2 lots down from that house that he built for his father, right, in the next year. And at this time, it's interesting looking at that shot is, even though there were several subdivisions around here, most of the streets hadn't been paved. And so if you know that area around Boulder Heights, there was no Hillcrest or Fifth or even Sunrise at that point. The way you got that was going, there's an Oliver Lane right between 4th and Hillcrest now. You sort of went out the end of that and up the hill. So for those of us who lived in that area for a while, we know that area pretty well. So you get that gist of that, right? But then the next year, there's Ben and Flossie's house, and this photo we were pretty sure, and this helped us confirm it was 1912. And even from the shot here on the bottom left, you can sort of see the house above, a shot taken at 3rd and Finley, and it's prominently sitting up there, and we have that dated pretty well too, right? So you can sort of see that. And so interesting enough, as you look at the paper over the next few years, the newspaper locally, occasionally people will call this Lister Hill. You'll see that, oh, something's going on Lister Hill. There's water rolling down Lister here and flooding my lot, that kind of stuff. Right? Now, Philip passes away in 1915. Ben decides that, in the family decides they could use the money, right? So they go ahead and sell it to a lady named Della Spear. Now, Della lives in San Diego. But she owned lots of property. She was making her income by renting properties, renting properties. And so we're pretty sure she just rented out. And finally, in 1918, we have a little note in the Scout that this noted San Diego attorney, Wade Garfield, and his family will be renting the Lister house for the winter. Of course, they wouldn't leave until 1966, I think. But anyway. But so they seem to like the place, right? And so we'll sort of get that. So we have a new person, right? Now the Garfields are a fascinating group of folks. One of the things that and the family's given us a lot of information about this house. And Mary's an interesting lady in herself, college graduate, but ended up with 7 children. She didn't have any other job other than doing some artwork. But basically, he was a well-known attorney. And when I started digging a little more about his history, and the understanding was that he was also fairly conservative. He, in 1930, was the guy who tried to convince the city that because of the Great Depression, we should probably annex into San Diego because he was convinced we were going to go bankrupt. Luckily, his vote, it didn't go through. We didn't disincorporate, but he was sort of pushing that. He was very much anti-tax, and you could see these sort of things in his sort of professional stuff. But when I looked into his law cases, it was fascinating. I think 99% of the cases I looked had his name on it were family law, divorce cases. And the one thing I noted was that every single time he defended the wife. I could never find a case that he ever defended a husband in a divorce case. So interesting, it sort of shook my mind. Oh, wow, that's interesting kind of little detail. You wouldn't learn about somebody until you really dig into it, right? So you see this sort of public persona, he's very fight the taxes, be very fiscally conservative. But his legal practice really was about helping ladies through these issues, right? So fascinating little pieces. Now, Mary was a trained artist as well. She loved to paint, and she would do some acting and things. And they suddenly get right into it. We begin by the spring of 1919, we're seeing he's involved with the Chamber of Commerce, she's in the Women's Club, they're doing fundraiser events, they're doing socials, he's getting involved in the Park Commission to build the swimming pond at Collier Park. And they like it so much that in December of 1919, Mary pens this little poem about La Mesa, titled Lines to La Mesa. And I won't read it, it's in my book if you want to get a copy of it. But it basically is this ode to this amazing little town and how wonderful it is, and it sits among the hills, all right? And they actually go out and print about 1,000 little cards that they sell, and the goal of those cards, fundraiser, is to pay off the mortgage at the Women's Club, which they successfully help do by selling these little poem cards with a nice picture on the back that they pay for completely. So you can see that sort of civic focus, right, of these folks. And I'll just tell you, but by the way, what happened was in 1925, the Chamber of Commerce said, maybe we should retitle that to the Jewel of the Hills, which of course has and still is the motto and the tagline for the city of La Mesa today. Comes from that poem Mrs. Garfield penned. They just decided to give a little different spin on the marketing, Jewel of the Hills, but it's basically the same exact poem. So in addition to this, Mary is a very well noted artist. She's trained in the plein air style. In fact, one of her good friends is Charles Fries, probably renowned as San Diego's most well-known plein air artist. And there's several articles we'll see of Mr. Fries is over visiting his friend the Garfields, blah, 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 blah. And to give you sort of just one little tone of her position in the art community, in 1940 there was an art show on her front lawn that included Fries, Maurice Braun, and Alfred Mitchell, who arguably pre-modern era are three of the most famous San Diego artists ever to walk around this place, right? That's the kind of folks had, and when you go to visit this house, you'll know that they were wandering around there showing off their art. We're very hopeful to have we have several of her paintings in our collection. We hope to have them at display at the house. But you can just tell you, so Miss Garfield, very civic-minded, Jewel of the Lady, right? Writes this amazing poem, ode to that. The kids all involved in the community as well, schools and everything, right? Lots of events happen at this house. This just gives a few examples. You know, the Mothers and Grandmothers Club, for example, meeting there. Wedding showers, all kinds of interesting things. And when you look at them listed in this 1927 list of some of the key people, the porters that you see are listed in there, and others you're going to hear about, all part of the circle that they were running in back at that time. The family continued to be involved. Son Fenton ends up working for the FBI, becomes a judge, was a city council member, eventually joins his father's firm. Other son, the youngest son, Jim, who was named for a distant cousin, James Garfield. You may have heard of him. He was a president of the United States. That family's connected there. Both of the daughters' weddings held on the property. And when you get to this property, you'll understand why he can accommodate this, as well as all kinds of other fun events and things that would go on over the years there. And by the way, and the one daughter ended up marrying Mr. Culkin, and Wayne was also their family was very significant. In fact, if you are National Little League alums, you may go play on Culkin Little League Field. That's the family, right? So that's what we're talking about, connections throughout. And here's this property, wonderfully preserved, and was landmarked about 20 years ago by these folks, and we're very happy to have them share the house with us and the grounds, which are fabulous as well. All right, so that's Boulder Heights, right? So now let's move over to the west side of town into the area that it's Mount Nebo, right? And we have several houses that we're going to feature in the Lookout Park area. But just to give you an idea, this was all part of Robert Allison's property originally, as you can see from this sort of turn-of-century map, just sort of gives you a feel where we're looking at. And in 1897, you can see what is nothing up there. In 1897, it's even too steep to plant citrus trees, right? It's just sort of up the hill there, and that little point, which will become later Prospect Park. But you're getting a feel of still the agricultural position of this place early on. Starting about 1907, Park Grable begins to get hold of this property. Mr. Grable's house is actually up on the end of Date Avenue. You probably remember that from one of our tours. And you begin to see the development of the streets and those wonderful brick retaining walls that you see throughout the older neighborhoods by a guy named Eli Reynolds' company. He had a company for those manufacturing those blocks. You'll see those all over our streets in the older neighborhoods there, just getting that going. This is about a 1910 picture. So even though Park Grable's edition and the Park edition are two of the earliest, Lookout Park was just a year later, and it featured just the sort of north half of what is the Mount Nebo and down below all the way out to Choyas Road there. Of course, the advertising is there, and I mean, what better advertising than Mount Nebo, right? You know the story in the Bible, right? This is where Moses stood to see the Promised Land. Where you can see the Promised Land. I mean, what better advertising could you have, right? And so you began to see this, and of course the suburban push, come to these view lots. So unlike some of the lots down below, most of these were view lots carved into the hillside of Lower Mount Nebo Peak. And, climb Mount Nebo, get your spot, don't miss it, right? All those kinds of things. Park Grable making a major. And by the way, the guy who actually laid this out for them and helped manage the project was Ben Lister. So, and at the top of that was what they called Prospect Park, which was sort of the peak of Mount Nebo at that time that they considered it. So you can see that subdivision sort of skirting up the slope, and we can see that from a couple of these shots around 1910. You can see how Pasadena, Fairview are sort of cut into the hillside. They're still that narrow, by the way, streets, if you go up there today. But give you a feel of those who are starting to try to build up on the hill to get those lots. Another shoot looking west this time, from Boulder Heights looking west, you could see how the streets are sort of carved in up above the Dade Avenue area, which was the original Grable addition, which is the first lower subdivision area. Right, so we began to see then folks realizing that they had some pretty nice lots, and we're starting to think about building some pretty nice houses to go with it, as those standard bungalows you might see down below. Some of those you might know about is the Worth House. The Worths were merchants who had come out here as well. He owned stores downtown, built this lovely home in 1913, and began to, have all kinds of interesting events and parties and things at this house. Down from that is the house Eli Reynolds built for his sister, Mary Hodgson, which is still there. We're very close there, built in the next year, and certainly another house that a lot of people see as a landmark when they go up onto Mount Nebo. And then there's a really nice lot just above that and a little up, which is a little higher up, just below Prospect Park, that's going to be the site of the Todd House. Illinois merchant Orion W. Todd was extremely successful, and he brought some attention with him. He apparently was looking around Los Angeles as well, because there's some press of him up there, some merchant looking for a new home in Southern California, and then it starts to hit the papers in San Diego and eventually in La Mesa, right? And in November of 1911, he buys 4 lots up there, 2 big lots and a couple smaller ones that worked out, but to place a unique hilltop home, right? And in fact, it's such news that it not only made the San Diego Union, but it also made the Building and Contractor, the Southwest Contractor Manufacturer magazine, posted that Little La Mesa was having O.W. Todd build plans for a modern, quote, residence to be erected on Mount Nebo. So, I mean, we're getting some this is the first time La Mesa starts to get architectural attention, I'll tell you that, about what's going on for building what he estimated would be an $8,000 home. Most houses at this time were probably costing somebody $800 to $1,000 to build a nice bungalow, right? They end up getting the plans from an architect from Los Angeles by the name of E.W. Stillwell. Interesting guy. He had studied at the University of South Dakota, but also spent some time in Chicago studying under sort of the influence of Wright and folks like that on what was known as the Prairie School. It's about the same time. He moves out to burgeoning Los Angeles in 1905, and though he does do work, his main income is producing plan books that are popular. They are manufactured and they're advertised through all of the noted magazines, and the family lore of the Todds is that they saw this ad in the House Beautiful magazine and then called them up and got the book and decided to pick the house style they wanted, which is sort of a mixture of prairie with some mission style influences on it, right? Very prominent and beautiful home, really sort of the first, I'll call prestige home built in La Mesa in many ways. And the story also goes that noted San Diego horticulturalist Kate Sessions was involved in the initial landscaping, which, as you can see by this 1920 photo, did pretty well. It almost ate the house, actually. Looks like there. Right? And we know the date on this house being opened, both because December, they're saying they're getting their permits, in that on July 4th, 1912, there is a dual event, a fireworks show fired off on there, and the housewarming for the Todd's home, of which they claimed 100 neighbors and friends had attended. So you're going to get to relive that on a tour day with around 100 people at a time there. So enjoy that. And they decided to name their house Keweedin, which apparently, I know this is obviously appropriation, but apparently means the path to your home. In other words, to find the way home. So this is the place where we go to find the way home. So after searching all through, they found their home here in La Mesa. So Todd, his wife Mary, their 4 children and their in-laws end up moving in the house. They're going to live there till both of them pass away. The kids move on. Son Harry and wife Thelma return in the 50s, take over after the parents are passed on. And Thelma just happens to turn out to be one of the founders of the La Mesa Historical Society in the 70s, which I will tell you, this is clearly not the first time the History Center has had some events there, but certainly another great opportunity with our current owners who just bought the property a few years ago to be able to share with us this amazing piece of architecture and history. And what more makes it sort of interesting is that the Todds become involved in a little social club there that was known for about 10 years as the Mount Nebo Club. And these become sort of the society leaders. And they all love to climb up to one of those cool houses and have their events up there, whether it's the Worth House or the Todd House or others. And they begin to have lots of events and parties. And this is where we believe, and actually we know, the origins of the Easter sunrise services begin. Supposedly Mr. McDonald was the first to go up there in 1913. The next year he invited more of his neighbors, and in 1915 it became a publicly announced event. And in fact, in 1915, according to this, they moved the Todd's piano out of the house up to Prospect Park, so they would have a piano on site, so when the sun rose, they could do that. Now, if you saw my other talks on this, of course, we would know that the larger and more prominently advertised Mount Helix would eventually take that over in 1917 when they decided not to do it during the war. The next year they came back and agreed that it would be better to have it on the larger Mount Helix, and so it's been there ever since. But that's where this long-standing tradition here in La Mesa of having an Easter sunrise service begins, right up here, and the Todds were all part of that. And there's a photo of the 1915 event, everybody marching up there, et cetera, et cetera. So, and when you go up there on the tour, you'll be able to see that spot. So you're going to enjoy the Todd House. Todd House is an amazing piece of architectural history, amazingly preserved. A couple of recent projects there done fully in standards. Just an amazing piece of property. You're going to just love it. It's truly one of the prestige homes of La Mesa and still wonderfully preserved. All right, well, so in the meantime, there's still a lot of lots up there up on that hill, right? As well as then the boom of the 20s hits. There's another real estate boom. We begin to see a lot of development. This is when Mount Helix area and Calavo Gardens really starts to take off. And we begin to see other subdivisions such as the Highlands and the Country Club Estates and all begin to put up, and all the wonderful advertising that goes with that. And on that south side, just south up to the top peak we now call Summit Rock Peak, was developed by the folks Love and Tow. He has Windsor Hills. And they get very involved in this, and it's sold by the Grable, Bryfus, and Francisco, which is the sort of evolution of the Park Grable Company, and they begin to deal with that. And so by late 26, they are beginning to do that, and you can see these sort of fanciful advertising that you would see in the 20s that are very popular. And now you see the development. It will all attract all the way up to the other peak up from above Mount Nebo. You know, Hollywoodland moves to San Diego, right? Look at that. Build your castle in Windsor Hills, right? Mount Nebo. And it comes some of the over-the-top wonderful advertising that, of course, leads to some mythology, is these ads claiming that Babe Ruth had bought into Windsor Hills. Myself and historian Bill Swank, who's a San Diego baseball historian, we looked up and down, back and forth, can never find any deeds or anything that Ruth owned any lots or anything else. So he was barnstorming through, as they would do to make extra money in the winters. They come out west, and you know, because the major leagues were all back east back then, so they'd come out west, and the stars would come and play. And there's a famous shot of him holding a shotgun like a baseball bat out on Sweetwater Reservoir, you know, like he's going to swing at a duck or something. And he does these ads, right? You know, and yeah, I'd live here. I'd live here if but you don't, and you're not, and you didn't, and you got your payment for your ads, and you moved on. But anyway, so, and he couldn't even say it because, unfortunately, like a lot of these 20s, in the late 20s, a lot of these subdivisions went under a thing called the Mattoon Act. Rolando was hit. There was about 40 tracts countywide that basically went into foreclosure by 1930 because they had overspent on improvements before the lots had been sold. And the way that worked, there was a pyramiding tax thing where only the improved lots picked up the unimproved lots, which is not a good for a tract of 150 lots when 10 houses are built. Nobody wants to be number 11, right? And so they end up going to foreclosure for about 8 years, and no houses are built in Windsor Hills until those bonds are bought out in the late 30s. But that's sort of I had to tell that story. Everybody always asks me that story. Windsor Hills, Babe Ruth? No, Babe Ruth did not live there. And this 1929 sandbar map gives you an idea of just how many empty lots there still are, right? And this is just showing down by the Prospect Park side of it and down in that area, right? Okay. Well, just up there, but by the late 30s, things begin to pick up. Lots are being sold still. And one of those that's going to be featured on this tour is the James and Corinne Dollhouse. And it's a classic 1930s, but after the exhibition in Balboa Park in the teens, San Diego finally, the 20s are the era of the revival styles, right? Everything from French, Normandy, Tudor, right? But San Diego really bought into Spanish and Mediterranean as its sort of number one. So if you go to neighborhoods like, I'm in Kensington now, 90% of our houses are Spanish colonial, maybe 5 to 10% are Tudor, right? That's sort of the where if you go to West LA, you'll find them all, right? You'll find everything. We sort of that. And so it was sort of San Diego style. And James Dahl actually owned the Ford dealership in El Cajon at the time. He also owned some dealerships back in Ohio where they were from originally. Even though they loved living out on Mount Nebo, they actually had rented there for about 8 years before they bought this lot to build a house in 1938. And possibly to make the money of that, he sold his dealership to a La Mesa guy named Elmer Drew, who owned that dealership for a while before he's selling it. And then they ended up building this lovely Spanish eclectic house in 1938. We could find no names of contractors in the permits or anything, and there is some family lore that perhaps this was built by the family themselves, that they may have done that. That's was still pretty possible if you had folks who knew how to do it. As long as you're building past inspection, you didn't have to hire a contractor necessarily back then. And it's quite possible. But there are also plenty of craftsmen and workmen who would come in and do whatever you needed, plastering or whatever. So it's quite possible that's what the case, why we couldn't find any details on it. But it's clearly clear. It's interesting is that his wife and 3 sons decide they're going to stay here, and he can go back half the year and spend it in Ohio to keep the dealership. And so that's basically what he does until he retires in 1960, is he spends half his time in Ohio, while she and the sons stay here in sunny San Diego. They all end up in La Mesa and end up all graduating, the sons all from Grossmont High and everything. Anyway, so just the idea of sort of a typical story of a businessman buys a wonderful view lot up near Prospect Park and ends up building a house. Since we're talking about our veterans, it is true that both the older son served in World War II. I think the third one just made it right at the end. And their oldest son, George, giving the ultimate sacrifice, killed in action over Japan in 1944. It's interesting enough, what we find about Corinne is that she was very vocal, and she tended to write a lot of interesting editorials in the paper. She was fairly conservative and at the beginning named to the Republican Party Central Area Committee for many years, and was very involved in those things. When James finally retired, they moved back and decided to cash in and move to La Jolla and sold the house off to another family at that time, but certainly involved locally in schools and other events politically. It's a fascinating house. The owner before, our current owner, did a lot of work on the backyard and really put out some beautiful gardens and areas that you're going to love. And our current owner, who's been there for over 20 plus years, has infused this house inside and out with art and design and decor. There's some wonderful illustrated painting and all kinds of things, interest in art and animals and all kinds of wonderful stuff. You're just going to love this house. It's a beautiful house. And it is our newest house, 1938, on the tour this year. So get a chance to see modern stuff, 1938. So our final tour house also goes from Lookout Park. This one has an interesting history too. We've been digging into this a little bit. The tax records say it was built in 1910, but the lore and everything was that it was built in 1929, but its style didn't match up. We kept digging, and we finally got some information out of the county that what happened in 1929, that was a second story had been added, creating quite a different, and you'll see that in a minute here. And that second story was built for its brand new owner, Phineas Packard. Now, by this point, Packard is an extremely well-known businessman in San Diego. He runs the Arts and Crafts Press, which is one of the top printing establishments. He ends up becoming involved in many organizations. He's a founding member of the San Diego Lions Club. He was president of the Printers Association, was very involved in organizations like the Salvation Army and civic and art committees. He was very much involved in amateur photography and filmmaking clubs, and was very much in that realm of life, right? And so he also had, and his wife, Marie, had 4 children. And so it's right, if you look at this house when you go see it today, you'll understand why they needed to add some space then. So they added the whole second story. Now they had moved to La Mesa in 26, rented for a couple years, so they were able to get this. And that time, Marie, the wife, had become very involved. Almost a year after she gets there, she's elected to be president. She swam every day she would drive downtown San Diego to go to the YWCA to swim, and really, some interesting things he approached in the 30s. Unfortunately, she passes away in 1941, but she had made her mark, as did many of her husband and family in La Mesa and around the community. So this shot is about mid-1935. We know they moved in because it made the paper in November of 1929 that the second story was completed and added onto probably what was a simple colonial-style bungalow added into that. It's got a few Italian elements, but pretty much sort of a colonial style with a second story, right? Also we know about it is at that time, he hired landscape architect Milton Sessions, who was the nephew of Kate Sessions, to do the landscape. They actually have the plans. Fortunately, a lot of it's changed, but some of the stuff, when you get there, you'll see some of it's still there. Some of the pathways, things are still there that probably go back to Sessions' design for the landscape. But like I said, more art, not just printing and all. Their eldest daughter, Ella Marie Packard, was extremely talented. I found a newspaper article when she was 6-year-old. She was doing a piano recital at some major arts event, right? She was also a dramatist, set designer, swimmer, and an artisan of great repute. She graduated from Grossmont High School and went to San Diego State College, where arriving just about the same time that Professors Bill Brassino and Ilsa Hamann Rocco, and our last year's tour, we talked about Ilsa and her influence, but even before she married Lloyd Rocco, in setting up the art department there and pushing it. And it's important that Ella Marie and Genevieve Bergerson were the first two students to paint a WPA-style mural at San Diego State, and the work of Professor Seth Malios to preserve what's left of those in the old campus. Go Aztecs, by the way, I'm a double grad. Is very important. She then ends up getting a job as a school teacher at Francis Parker, teaching art. There she meets the drama teacher, Jackson Woolley, in 1940. And after following him around during the war, he, of course, gets drafted and is sent back east, and they hang around it, and they come back after World War II. They become two of those amazing artists that we talked about last year in the Allied Craftsmen. They are main players in this organization. They are extremely talented, and they end up having to give up teaching because they're full-time artists. And they will practice up until Ella Marie's passing in 1976, including national exhibitions for their really amazing work, especially in enamel on copper pieces, which was a very sort of cutting-edge, unique sort of adaptation of different techniques into art during the modern era. And to give you a little feel of what their stuff is like, there are some pieces. They did some of the work on the downtown San Diego Civic Theater, which Lloyd Rocco and other modernist architects were involved in. And our current owner actually has one of their pieces in the house, which you'll get to see. But just to give a feel, these were nationally renowned folks, and she went to high school and college, period. She was living there at this house with her folks. Now, in the meantime, when Marie passes away, only 4 years later after the war, Phineas ends up selling, kind of in a smaller house. All his kids were about out of the house. A couple other families owned it, the Campbells and the Lamberts, until about 25 or so years ago, maybe 30 years ago, when our current owner ended up buying this house. And he's a longstanding theater professor person, and has, I'll tell you, theme furnished is an understatement, this entire home and grounds with antiques, artifacts, and art and artisans from the following folks: the Woolleys, Western artist Olaf Weghorst, Soho founder Robert Miles Parker, photographer, illustrator Robert Vaura, and Broadway designer Greg Barnes, who was one of his students. Oh, by the way, and it also has a treehouse. So, now I'm going to tell you as you could see here, eclectic is the word. Now just remember, you're going to want to see every inch of this, but the tour's only 6 hours long, okay? So if you spend 5 hours at this one, you're going to have to rush the others, and they're all big and beautiful too. But I'm just telling you, this is a really unique thing. You're going to see amazing stuff, things that you would never think, but of the artist, of someone who deals with theater and the arts, you're going to get it here. So our other connection is the current owner, as well as we're in the last house, this one here as well, that you're going to see some of that. All right, so those are the houses, but we also, once again, just like last year where we were able to enjoy celebrating the centennial of an important institution, Grossmont High School, we're going to celebrate with our partner this year, who's also just recently celebrated their centennial. That's St. Martin's Catholic Church. So this is where the tour center is going to be. This is where you're going to park and pick up the shuttles, and it'll bring you back at the end, and you loop around as many times as you want till 3 o'clock, but basically that's where we're going to be set up this year. And they've agreed to be that, and also to open both their old original church and their current 1965 chapel for people to get a tour, and they'll have folks there for us. But to just give you some background, up to 1920, there was no Catholic church here. There was a small church in El Cajon established the year before, but this was the first Catholic church sort of focus in the area, serving La Mesa, Lemon Grove, La Mesa Heights, and all that area. And it was in November of 1920 that they met at Stokes Funeral Home, which the photograph I had, I don't have a decent shot of it alone, but you might remember it from a previous discussion and talk. That's where the Flying A Film Company was in 1911-12. On the other half of it was the mortuary. Well, by 1920, the whole building was with the mortuary surface, and had a chapel on the one side that had used to have been the studio. And so Mr. Stokes offered up to allow them to meet there to discuss what they wanted to do. They got support from the local diocese support, because at that time San Diego was part of the Los Angeles area diocese, that they could go moving forward, and they would send out a priest after this. And they began to then hold services there at Stokes starting in November of 1920 with the goal of finding a property to build a new Catholic church, right? And so with that, they quickly moved into they were looking for properties around, and finally were able to get a property just off of Lookout Avenue on Normal Street, just right up, just up a couple lots you'll see here. And luckily, an anonymous donor, they later found out who it was, she actually came out eventually, gave them $5,000. She was from Los Angeles to start this new Catholic church here in La Mesa. So with that donation, they jumped, and possibly some of the fastest construction they must have been ready, because literally the next week, contractor architect James Roach came down with the plans and started construction. And just 6 weeks later, they were able to hold the first service there on Christmas Day, 1921, even though the chapel wasn't complete 100%. They actually had to borrow chairs, and they got the Episcopalians to give them an altar, and they got some other stuff, and everybody chipped in so that they could have their service. And the report here is fascinating, because it was one of those Decembers in which there were like a 6-day straight rainstorm that hit right on Christmas. And so the Father McCormick's sitting here reporting about, I'm so glad you all came because I didn't think you were going to make it, because it was pouring rain, and we had to coddle this together. And then, of course, after that, they were able to finish the construction around, and by spring, they had both the main church and the parish house completed so that the church could get going. For its first couple years, it was known as Our Lady of Mercy, and then in 1924, changed its name to St. Martin's of Tours. But establishing a place for the Catholic community here in La Mesa and surrounding areas in that period. And as you can see, that was their location just up. All those houses you see on the right side, that's where Vaughn's Shopping Center is now. Give you a little idea, right? And that's where the original church. And obviously by the 1940s, it was far too small. So being efficient and effective, they moved the church, and there's a picture of it. In fact, when you go into the old chapel to look, the docents will be there. They actually have home movies of it being moved. You can see that on their website. Somebody took film of it, luckily, Super 8 film of it, to see it and move it to the new site, right? And you can see how it was remodeled a little bit, given a stucco finish, the bell tower raised up a little bit, and it's still been preserved recently. They did some more renovation of it. And then growing continually again as of the community in the 60s, they then had El Cajon architect Arthur Decker designed the 1965 church, so it is a modern style church. But interesting enough, there's a lot of art from the original. There's some stained glass, there's some statuary, as well as some more recent murals and artwork in that church, the more modern church, as well as fully restored the 1921-22 church. So we're very excited. Both will be open on tour day for you, and we're really pleased that the church and the Father has allowed us to have those open. So you can also see those if you not want to get in there too often for whatever reason. This is your chance to see it, and they're very open, and we're really pleased to have them partner with us on this year. Whew. You guys ready? See, I could talk for an hour and 50, but it's only an hour and 15, so we're good. So certainly if there's any questions, but of course remember, if you don't have your tickets yet, you should get them, because this tour is going to be a really special one. All right, well, hey, thanks again to all our sponsors. And of course, La Mesa Dale School, go Lions, who, like I said, next year will have their 75th. As well as, of course, all our volunteers and especially our homeowners. A couple of you are out here who are going to help us once again raise a little money and educate everybody on the great history of La Mesa and these beautiful homes. As well as, of course, our crew and our team here to put on today's roundtable, Tracy Stotts and George Fajaris and Cheryl Castro, Veronica Marzel, Stephen Christensen, and our sound man, Steve Churchill. And thanks, everybody, and we'll see you at the tour. Hey, thanks. How you doing?